Hello, everyone. Thank you for that warm welcome. I couldn't really understand what the introduction entailed, but I did hear the word Rohingya. I wanted to start off, especially since the audience is quite small, to ask if people have heard of Myanmar outside of the context of the Rohingya or the coup in 2021. So like, just by show of hands, who's heard of it? Who's heard things other than that? Okay. It's actually a lot more than I was expecting. I don't know if we can get a mic around, but could we get a couple volunteers? I just want to get a sense of the knowledge in the room of what do you know about Myanmar other than the coup and the Rohingya? Any volunteers? I don't mean to put you on the spot. There's no wrong answers. Oh, there's some over there.
Thanks. Hello. I've just heard from friends it's just a beautiful, beautiful country. That it's one of the best places to go walking, go for hikes. The food is incredible. These are the sorts of things that I heard probably about 10, 15 years ago.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Hi, I'm Anna. I'm from the Philippines. So this might not count because we're kind of neighbors, but I have been to Myanmar in Lake Inle, and it was beautiful with, so we visited fishing villages, and we were oriented on the unique way that fishing is done in that part of Myanmar. They fish with, using a part of their legs. So I loved it. The weather, the people are always very friendly, and yeah, apart from what else is in the news, I will always hold that memory of Myanmar.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you so much for answering that. So I think people have a sense of Myanmar, other than the political violence and the strife that's happening there, as this sort of very beautiful place to visit. People are very kind, the food is really good, and it's really good for tourism. And I think a lot of people know that it's a country that recently, in the 2010s, began to open up and come out of self-isolation after the military dictatorship that was ruling the country for the last 60 years had started to hold elections and start to give up some political power, although there was still power sharing. So I wanted to paint a little bit of a picture about what it was like growing up in Myanmar, just so you can understand the context of where we ended up in the 2010s. So when I was growing up in Myanmar, my uncle actually ran a ice making factory, and basically how he earned a living was by cutting up blocks of about 1 meter square of ice and delivering them to people's homes, because we didn't have electricity growing up. If there was a car in your street or in your village, that area was considered to be quite wealthy. And we didn't really have very much electricity, and we definitely didn't have the internet or really reliable connection to the outside world. And so in the last 10 years, when the country began to open up, we saw people go from essentially using like hand-cranked radios, where there was very clear buttons that did very specific things, to basically everyone having access to a glass box that functioned in a language that people just truly didn't understand. I mean that from a very literal sense, in that most of the phones were either from Korea, like Samsung, Huawei, those sort of Chinese phones, or American-made phones, or American company phones like Apple, where literally the language was in Korean, Chinese, or English, and people had no ability to use these technologies in a way that really respected or allowed them to be agents in how they use these things. These were kind of just imposed upon to them. And then on top of that, you had companies like Facebook, which came in quite aggressively and paired with the telecom companies to create data packages where Facebook was essentially free to use in Myanmar. And they invested very little in localization, actually, when it came to Myanmar. So on top of the phones themselves not being in a language that people could understand and use, you also had what is basically the main app that people were using because it was essentially free to use, ended up being in a language or not being in local languages. And so we ended up in a situation where, I'm sure as many of you know, social media platforms were a big contributing factor in the way that hate speech and offline violence was coordinated in order to commit a genocide against the Rohingya that has really had cycles of violence throughout Myanmar's history, starting from really the 1960s, but really culminated in 2017 when nearly over 700,000 people were essentially forced out of the country for their own safety as the military began to attack their villages, especially women and children, and just enacting great violence onto them. So having given that context, what I really want to talk about in terms of my subject is to get us to really question how we approach issues like what happened in Myanmar, especially in the aftermath of seeing so many people suddenly come online, suddenly get access to these technologies, and then almost immediately use that technology in a way that caused really devastating harm, not just to the minority groups that were being targeted and affected, but also just to the sort of fundamental humanity of majority groups who, I think of it as in being unable to see the humanities of groups that you see as outside of you, you lose a part of your humanity as well, because you can no longer recognize your fellow humans as humans. So the way that happened in Myanmar in the last 10 years or so was that a lot of money was being poured into digital and media literacy programs. So these were programs that basically took as its foundational belief that people in Myanmar, because they were so new to the internet, because they were so new to these technologies, were digitally illiterate, right? That they were able to use these technologies, but they weren't able to use them safely or correctly. And I want to be clear that I'm making this critique from a place of essentially complicity. I also used to give trainings on digital literacy and really participated in trying to mitigate the harm that was being caused through the use of social media by trying to help people understand what hate speech is, why things go viral, how they can report things like that. But I think after a few years of doing that, what I started to understand was that by framing it this way, by saying that it's the users who are not able to use these technologies properly and safely, we are essentially allowing these companies to externalize the risks when it comes to the products that they're creating. And to basically say that we're not the problem, the users are the problem. And I think this is something that, obviously we all still around the world try to hold companies like Facebook accountable for their content moderation policies and things like that. But at the same time, I think when it comes especially to the global south, there is this pernicious habit of essentially going to people who are subject to these technologies coming into their countries and telling them that they're the ones who are lacking, when in fact, if we look at the way social media platforms are designed, they're designed, we see the same problems repeating themselves globally, right? These problems of hate speech, of disinformation, when it comes to things like COVID-19, and sort of how the virus was downplayed and how there was fear-mongering about the vaccines. It's not just the question of people the entire world not being able to use technology properly. I think at that point, when basically every user, every country, every context is dealing with these issues, we really have to ask ourselves, is this a design flaw? Is it fundamentally a problem in the way that these technologies are being designed? Yeah, so I had some more questions for the audience, if people don't mind. Can you raise your hand if you agree with the statement that social media platforms have the potential to cause harm to me and my society? Okay, that's basically everyone. Could I ask someone to volunteer and say why you still use these technologies?
Because while they have the potential to cause a lot of harm, they also have the potential to cause a lot of good. And for example, I run a frontline voice publication, and we can put our stuff out on social media.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a journalist, so I use social media constantly. And so I think, find it to be instrumental in the work that I do, not just the publishing of my work, but also just gathering information in the first place. And can I get another raise of hands for, if you agree with the statement, I feel like I can navigate social media platforms without being exposed to harmful content. Okay, way fewer hands. What about this next statement? I feel like I can navigate social media platforms without accidentally causing harm to others. Okay, a few more hands than the first one for the second question. Next question, or next statement is, I feel like I have access to resources to improve my ability to use social media safely. Okay, more hands than the last one. And I feel like I take the time to utilize those resources. Okay, I think we've seen a dramatic drop. Yeah, so I mean, I think this really showcases this problem of individualizing this problem, right? Nearly everyone in this room said that they feel that they can't avoid harmful content online. Quite a lot of people said that they felt that they might contribute to harm, even accidentally. And even though resources are available, people aren't necessarily utilizing it. And I'm sure there's plenty of reasons for that, right? Like, you don't have time. Like, you have work, you have other obligations. This just doesn't seem quite as important because you're probably, as an individual, not contributing to that much harm by yourself. And potentially, I think most people in this room also live in societies in which there is a lot more intervention and regulation that, for the most part, keeps your society safe. But when it comes to countries like Myanmar, we end up in a situation where the average person, and this was before the coup. Sorry, I keep referencing this coup. I don't know if everyone knows about the coup. So there was a coup in Myanmar in February of 2021, where the military overthrew the civilian elected government, and Myanmar has essentially devolved into nationwide conflict. The military has largely been able to imprison a number of political leaders, as well as activists, but they haven't really been able to exert full control over the country. They control the borders, the police, and the military, but in terms of sort of civilian administration, very few people are actually treating them as government. Sorry, that's just an aside. But yeah, I think the sort of exercise we did earlier really goes to showcase the idea that when we make it the individual's responsibility And it especially comes to countries where people make very little money, people have very little access to education. Right now, less than 50% of school-aged children are even enrolled in schools in Myanmar. And that's not to discount the fact that many of them will not actually be attending or not be able to attend the full year, even if they are currently enrolled. We create the situation in which we take away the responsibility and a movement for accountability towards tech companies by making it a problem of a lack from the actual individual. And I think it really would improve our activism if we could really reframe our understanding of social media and these platforms as a tool. If we think about cars or electric scooters, like the ones I've seen everywhere in Berlin, or things like video conferencing apps, or even things like Microsoft. Obviously, people can use those things to do harm, right? I mean, there was that tragic accident or incident that happened the other day with the car in Berlin. I'm sure people have coordinated terrible things on Zoom. Or people use the printing press to write terrible books that incite nations. But we don't make that a problem of the individuals who are using these tools, right? When they do exhibit the potential for harm, or actually cause harm, we in turn begin to regulate the actual tools. And we don't say that, it's just some people are bad at writing books. Some people are just bad drivers. And so or in those cases where those things happen, we create regulations to try to ensure that harm doesn't spread, right? Like, we don't just allow all people to drive cars, hit people, and then say, there's something wrong with the cars. If they were sort of causing genuine accidents. And I think it also, what the Myanmar case really shows is that, you had a population of people who didn't really have the internet before 2010. They had never really gone through the iterations of the internet, as so many people in this room probably have. They didn't go through the iterations of the physical technology, like Blackberries and iPods and then smartphones. And yet, when you took a brand new population, essentially, and introduced them to Facebook, it immediately dissolved into racial hatred and the genocide. So I think it really should make us question, what is happening in terms of the incentives that users have when it comes to Facebook, that this is the kind of content that gets promoted, and this is the kind of offline outcomes that come out of it. Because you essentially had a population that didn't have an online culture otherwise, right? I think globally we tend to sort of say it's anonymity online, it's sort of the cultures that have developed around MySpace or LiveJournal or whatever other websites that then migrated into Facebook and kind of melded together. But I think Myanmar really shows that even without all of that, if you're just given something that is designed exactly as Facebook is, you inherently trend towards harmful behavior online. I think also something I want to advocate or talk about today is that companies like Facebook also spend quite a lot of money on these sorts of initiatives. As I said, I gave a bunch of digital literacy trainings when I was still in Myanmar. And a lot of that money, in many cases, came from social media platforms who were insistent on entering countries like Myanmar without a local team, without people on their staff who spoke local languages or understood the local political context, and in many cases even were really immersed in local laws, but still wanted to be there because there was money to be made. Who then essentially took these donations and treated them as this great benevolent force, that they were somehow coming in and educating the natives on how to use this, bright, shiny new technology to connect them to the world, when in fact they were really papering over the harm that they were doing and their complicity and responsibility in it. And I think we should still take their money, because I do think digital literacy trainings can help. But I don't think we should allow them to use that money, use these numbers and these figures as a way to hide from the responsibility they have to create products that people can use safely. Products that if you come in without knowing anything, you don't immediately essentially end up on like the Burmese version of like Nazi propaganda. And I think it's especially problematic because these platforms and algorithms are designed to appeal to our most base nature, right? Like, we like a shiny thing. We like to fight, especially when we're anonymous. While there's events like this, there's civil society, there's journalists who can call them out, we have very little actual control over how these things are designed, but every little decision that is made at the policy level of social media giants effectively affects billions of people. And it's deeply, deeply anti-democratic. I think for them to be able to continue to use these sort of framing tricks in order to have us continue to believe that our individual relationship to these platforms and our individual usages of these platforms is our responsibility, and it's our responsibility to keep ourselves personally safe, and then also try to keep our community safe and try to prevent these much greater harms. Obviously we should all participate and do all those things, right? Like, me getting on stage and saying all of this doesn't mean that Facebook is actually going to change anything. But I think this is one small bit of framing that we can really start to challenge that would help us create or mold these companies and these systems and these tools into shapes that are much more human-friendly. And I think fundamentally, what I want to argue for is basically to say that these are tools. These things are meant to make our lives better. And oftentimes they do. But I don't know if we were to really calculate it out, if the good that they've done really outweighs the harm. And I think we really need to get to a place where we reevaluate just how much harm is being caused by factors that are really out of the control of the hands of individuals, but are still being framed as the responsibility of the individual. Okay, that's it. Does anyone want to start a discussion?
Irgendwelche Fragen? Dann würde ich nämlich da mit dem Mikrofon hinkommen. Oh, yeah.
Hello, hi, amazing, thank you so much. I was really struck by what you said about the fact that the people lost their humanity. That Hegelian dialect idea of if you don't see another person as a human, you lose a bit of your own humanity. And then that final question that you asked on the good outweighing the bad, how can you even quantify these kind of fundamental losses to our humanity, whether or not that's the loss of freedom, justice, peace, love, with these kind of conveniences of being able to tell someone you're 5 minutes late for dinner? How have you managed to kind of reconcile that in your own mind?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think for me, especially coming from a Myanmar context, it's not just a question of conveniences. Obviously, these technologies have helped make life more convenient, but in a lot of ways, it's fundamentally given opportunities to people they might not have otherwise had, right? Like during COVID, the number of school children who might not have otherwise had any access to educational material was dramatically improved by the existence of the internet and social media in Myanmar. And the sort of economic activities that especially can happen at the village level that were not possible before, especially for women, were dramatically increased. So I think, I make all these critiques as someone who deeply loves technology, who's really optimistic about the role that it can play in our life if we are able to convince governments as well as our sort of fellow people in our societies to essentially wrestle back control from these companies, to tell them that the way that they're operating is undemocratic, it is not fit for our current societies, and that these sort of create engagement at all costs, maximize profits at all costs model of programming these platforms is not going to be acceptable. Sorry, I know I didn't answer that question.
So, are there any more questions? Oh yeah, Ovi.
Hi. Do you perceive even, say, hate speech as a form of democratic expression on social media? Because if we're speaking about democratizing social media, then having a variety of opinions is very much a part of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really complicated question on one hand, in that from a legal perspective, in countries like Myanmar, we do have a hate speech law, and it is used entirely to jail, imprison critics of the government. People are told that, by criticizing a policy, you are inciting hate against the government or inciting hate among the citizenry. So I think, despite thinking that hate speech is bad, definitely bad, and that it should be regulated out of social media platforms especially, or just generally in public. I think it's also very dangerous when we enter into this territory of laws, especially when it comes to authoritarian governments. But yeah, I mean, I think in terms of the question of hate speech's place in democracy, it's a bit of a paradox, right? Because in order to protect freedoms and equality, there are certain things that we just simply cannot tolerate, right? Like if we are having speech that fundamentally questions the humanity of another person, then I think that in and of itself undermines democracy and any ability for us to achieve real justice in our societies. And therefore, we must find a way to not have it be an acceptable part of the public sphere.
Any more questions? Please raise your hand. Oh yeah, over here.
Thank you for the insight. I know very little about Myanmar, so I learned a lot. And I was wondering, how do you see the role of monopolies causing this kind of, platform where hate speech can thrive? Because I wonder, writing books, there's a huge competition around writing. So, and you cite Facebook as the only actor coming in providing this. So I was wondering, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, Myanmar, I think, is a really good example of a monopoly in that basically until the coup, Facebook was the only platform that people were really using. Like if you worked in Myanmar there and you didn't have a Facebook, like you weren't going to get a job in the first place, so you wouldn't be working. But like everything happens on this one platform. And so, I think it becomes this issue again of trying to wrestle away control back from these platforms. I think a lot of civil society in Myanmar for a while were really advocating that Facebook override the Myanmar government's definition of hate speech because, obviously it was being used to persecute critics, but it also is a very dangerous thing for people to advocate, right? Because you're basically telling a company, hey, we as citizens would like you to decide which governments you do and don't want to listen to. It's just really tricky because I think a lot of these things might actually have different answers based on where our societies are in terms of how much freedom there is in each respective society and how sort of stable that freedom is. Because I think, if you take Myanmar again as an example, a coup overthrew, 10 years of work that people had been doing. And if we had actually gotten sort of aggressive regulation of these companies and the breaking up of these monopolies, then we might have ended up in a situation where during the coup, the military had much more control over companies like Facebook, where people were sharing, protesters getting shot in the head, children being killed, and all sorts of injustices and horrors because of government regulation. So, it's not a satisfying answer, I think, but as all things, it's complicated.